Hey there, my name is Brittany June Gamble, and I'm just here to talk about my reflection on Alison Dunning's guest lecture. Alison Dunning is someone whose work I revere. It left me with a few key takeaways, many of which I have little room to write or talk about. I'm going to organize this reflection just like my other around those few aha moments that I had, because Dunning's peer support lectures always do what good peer work tends to do. I've seen how fast that power shows itself in the hospital, especially in palliative care. Sometimes it's as small as who gets spoken to directly, who gets spoken about. Sometimes it's a person testing the room with one careful sentence about dying and everyone responding like the patient chart is the main thing that needs protecting. I left the lecture with three threads kind of braided together. Peer support is a values-based practice grounded in mutuality, dignity, and self-determination. And it is also a discipline that arrives inside systems shaped by credential hierarchy and the biomedical model, which means peers often enter teams where their role is misunderstood, it's minimized, or it's treated like a nice little add-on. And finally, peer support comes from a movement led by people with lived and living experience, which means the question of integration is always political. Dunning frames working with peers as an opportunity to challenge hierarchy and use one's position to open doors rather than guard them. So this is where my own positionality matters in practice. As an Anishinaabe woman, I carry Indigenous ways of knowing that are relational by design. In my worldview, knowledge is not a commodity stored in individual brains, but it's produced and carried through relationships, through responsibilities, story, and how we show up for one another over time. And that relational lens changes how I hear Dunning's emphasis on power sharing and mutuality. Peer support already speaks this language, and at the same time, peer support still lives inside settler systems that measure safety through surveillance, like quote-unquote risk through liability, and credibility through credentials, which I like to call these colonial credits. So this is a colonized set of assumptions of a person's capacity to perform. Part of what Dunning's lecture sparked for me is that peer support has done revolutionary work, and it still has room for decolonization, especially once it's pulled into the mainstream institutions. So Dunning really grounded peer support historically as resistance to a medical system that has repeatedly harmed people through coercion, forced institution, and criminalization. It just feels carceral to be there in general. She also traces how peer support continued after deinstitutionalization through consumer survivor initiatives and community-led spaces, even as peer roles have increasingly been pulled into these mainstream settings. So this history really matters because it explains why peer support does not exist simply just to fit in and make hospitals feel kinder. It exists because people need something different to survive. Not just to survive, but to thrive while they survive. So some of my key takeaways here are that relational knowledge is not soft. Relational knowledge is a form of expertise that changes outcomes. Peer support values in Canada explicitly center empathetic and equal relationships, self-determination, dignity, and authenticity, and trust. Peer support is also intentionally structured to reduce hierarchy and share that power. So that distinction is not theoretical, as it changed what becomes possible in conversation, especially around shame, fear, suicidality, and systems trauma. So this connects directly to my Indigenous epistemological grounding. When knowledge is relational, its support is not a technique you apply to someone. It becomes a shared space that you build with someone, where the person remains a full person and not just an issue that's being managed. And Dunning's lecture also names that peer support workers can build meaningful relationships in ways that help social workers do our job better. That's where she talks about the value of peer support in mainstream spaces and how it complements clinical care. And when I place that beside Indigenous relationality, I can feel how powerful peer work can be. And at the same time, the decolonizing edge shows up here again for me. Mainstream systems often treat relationship as a very nice thing and then return quickly to documentation, liability, and throughput. And those structures can hollow out the relational practices over time. Kopek and Smith actually warned that lived expertise cannot be treated as a symbolic nod, and that meaningful conclusion requires actual structure is throughout the policy process and embed long-term involvement within the governance. And that's Kopek and Smith's core argument about lived expertise in policy and governance, that it has to be built into structures and not just invited in occasionally. This has to be an ongoing process. And that logic applies to peer support too. A system can hire peers and still refuse to share decision-making power, evaluation control, and agenda-setting authority. And when that happens, lived experience gets harvested for optics. My next takeaway would probably be mostly related to my practicum teachings. My hospital placement has continuously taught me that social work and peer support kind of share a similar problem. Our roles are very misunderstood because our role challenges what counts as care. Dunning frames working with peers as an opportunity to be a champion of the discipline, which includes challenging hierarchies in teams and systems and advocating for the fair pay, the inclusion in decision-making, and the proper supervision. I've watched teams treat context with a patient like a distraction until the moment it turns into a preventable crisis. Then suddenly the patient's context becomes quote-unquote risk, and social work gets pulled in to document the consequences. And social work in hospitals is often treated like discharge planning or resources, like we are a practical add-on to the real work of medicine. But in practice, my role frequently involves challenging narrow definitions of care and pushing teams to see the personhood, the context of who they are as a person, and the biopsychosocial realities as clinically relevant information. And it's not just a vibe, as some doctors have expressed. It's actual patient safety. And it's the difference between someone being treated as a complex human being versus being reduced to a diagnosis or a bed fill problem or risk to management. This is where once again, I bring up the cover your ass culture shows up. In multidisciplinary spaces, social work often becomes the voice that reminds teams of the consequences of dismissing context. When allied health professionals do not recognize how intimately biopsychosocial factors shape health outcomes, the result is not just a nice to have. It can lead to life-altering and sometimes life-ending consequences. And in that sense, I see peer support as operating in similar terrain. Peer supporters bring a kind of knowledge that unsettle the comfort of purely biomedical explanations, and that unsettlement can make systems very defensive. Even PeerWork's position statement helps actually name why this misunderstanding becomes more than interpersonal tension. They describe peer support drift and how systems push peers into clinical or menial tasks that strip the role of its actual value. This mirrors what happens to social work too in my experiences. The system pressures roles that are relational and justice-oriented to become very administrative, risk-focused, and compliance-heavy. This kind of leads me into my next takeaway, which is liability. Liability is treated like a very sacred word in institutions, and Allison showed how it can silence life-saving conversations. And she makes that argument more explicitly in her Healthy Debate article. It describes how concerns around liability are used as a scapegoat for policies rooted in stigma, particularly around death, dying, suicide, and MAID, which is very closely tied to what I do in the palliative care unit. She gives the example of a peer supporter being expected to thank someone for sharing and then escalate to a clinician with the rationale framed around liability and risk. Dunning links that logic to credential gatekeeping, those colonial credits, and the dismissal of lived experience as a legitimate source of support for a person. And this connects strongly to what I see in the hospital culture all the time. The moment certain words appear, especially suicide, self-harm, capacity, or risk, systems immediately shift into scripted responses built around some professional obligation and a self-protection. I've sat in family conversations where someone finally names what they have been carrying, the actual thought of, I think they are dying. And you can feel the whole room tense, like that sentence is a threat. And that is exactly what Dunning is warning about. When systems treat death and dying like a liability trigger, they teach people to stop telling the truth, especially when it comes to their mental health or suicidal ideation. And that script can function like a great wall. It protects the institution and sometimes, but more often than not, leaves the person or the patient or the client feeling punished for their honesty. And Dunning names the deadly consequence of this pattern: policy that shuts down open conversation, that leads people to stop disclosing, and silence is not safety. And the silence isn't safety logic is essentially the heartbeat of Dunning's argument in, I think, the Healthy Debate piece. So from an Indigenous relational lens, this is also an epistemology problem. If the system trusts only credentialed knowledge and treats lived experience as unsteady or too risky, then the system is choosing a narrow definition of evidence and calling it objective. And Kopec and Smith argue that both policy and research can exploit lived expertise for outputs while placing less value on it as actual evidence. And they call for inclusion approaches that value the lived experience as evidence from the start. Lived expertise as evidence, not just narrative. Dunning's critique of liability culture fits inside that same argument. The system keeps telling itself that it's being responsible. Meanwhile, it's actually building policies that make honesty dangerous. I unfortunately experienced this with a palliative patient's family member, and it was challenging. So, moving on to what surprised or challenged me in the guest lecture. One surprise was how clearly Dunning located allied professionals really hit me, including social workers inside the power dynamic. She frames working with peers as requiring humility, curiosity, and a willingness to challenge hierarchy, and she names practical advocacy actions, which are big, like that parfait, the inclusion, the decision-making supervision, infrastructure, those everyday choices like who gets invited into meetings and whose voices are actually cited. And that kind of challenged me because it makes allyship measurable as a pattern of intentional choices and not just a feeling someone has. And the hospital taught me that a lot of harm actually happens very quietly under the banner of professionalism. In palliative spaces especially, you can feel the difference between care that is relationship-led and care that is self-protection-led, and that difference stays with you after you leave the unit. And social work is routinely misunderstood, it's questioned, it's narrowed, peer support is too. And when a role exists partly to challenge how care is defined, that role will always create friction in systems that prefer the predictability. The way Dunning framed things kind of gave me language for why my discomfort in those spaces is not just a personal insecurity. It has nothing to do with, an imposter syndrome or what other doctors have said being extra. It's a sign that the role is doing what it is supposed to do. That discomfort is what that means. I also felt the disability thread running underneath everything. As a person with a neurological disability, what many people perceive as an invisible disability, I'm familiar with credibility police and politics. You can be functioning, articulate, competent, and still have your reality treated as negotiable because people cannot see it. And PeerWorks explicitly frames peer support drift as potentially linked to disability discrimination, including environments where peer supporters experience disrespect or a lack of psychological safety and a devaluing of their own lived experiences, which is the foundation of their work. PeerWorks also points to the rights of disabled people. to just and favorable conditions of work and equal opportunity, pushing the conversation beyond quote-unquote team dynamics. And when credibility is granted conditionally, and when lived experience is treated as lesser knowledge, the workplace becomes ableist by default, which is not an accidental side issue. It is the terrain peer support and social work both have to navigate. And that leaves me with some remaining questions. Dunning's lecture kind of left me with questions that feel practical in the same way that hospital work is practical. You can feel them in your body during rounds, when you're charting, when you see who gets listened to, when you see which patients get believed. So how do I translate relational ways of knowing into spaces that treat relationships as secondary to risk management? So peer support and Indigenous epistemologies both emphasize relationship as knowledge, and what policies and practices protect that relational space from being overwritten by documentation and liability scripts. Next, what does meaningful inclusion look like when lived experience is invited in, but decision-making remains locked behind those colonial credits? This goes back to Copen and Smith warning that the lived expertise must be centered throughout the policy process and embedded long-term in governance. So, how do I advocate for governance power and not just the simple consultation? Next would be, how do I intervene when peer supporters are positioned as emotional cleanup for institutional harm? Dunning's lecture emphasized challenging hierarchy and advocating for infrastructure and supervision. So what would I do in the moment on a team when I see peer work being used, or let's say abused, to absorb system violence rather than shift it? A fourth question, how do we build suicide and death and dying policies that are grounded in lived experience without default escalation as the only legitimate response? Not that I don't want a job in social work, but, Dunning describes liability being used to justify keeping peers out of these conversations, despite peer supporters being well-equipped and eager to do this work. Next question would be, how do I challenge the credibility politics that follow disabled workers and peer workers into the workplace? The peer works connected drift and disrespect to disability protections and workplace obligations. So how do I use my actual role to interrupt ableism and credentialism without placing additional burden on peers to defend their legitimacy, especially as a social worker, a profession that is known to swing back and forth between elitism in our regulation and our licensing. And lastly, how do I stay accountable to decolonize while working inside institutions built on colonial logics of control? Peer support already disrupts hierarchy by design, but what does it mean to push peer support further towards, say, land-based or relational, community-defined notions of safety, especially when mainstream systems keep equating safety with surveillance? So I guess in the end, the lecture landed for me as both a professional lesson and a personal mirror, as peer support centers relationship, dignity, the power sharing, asking systems to stop treating lived experience as a helpful story that can be extracted while leaving authority untouched. It also sharpens something I'm learning in my hospital placement, that roles like peer support and social work often get misunderstood precisely because they refuse the comfort of that narrow biomedical care. And I know I'm repeating myself, but it's important. They keep insisting on, the term personhood. They keep insisting that context is clinical. They keep insisting that safety is not the same thing as institutional self-protection. But as an Indigenous social work student, I also leave this information holding a decolonizing question close. Peer support already resists hierarchy, and still, when it is absorbed into mainstream systems, it can be pressured towards the very logic it was created to challenge. So Dunning's critique of liability culture kind of showed how deeply that logic runs, and how easily policy can become a stigma story written into professional language. And my responsibility as a policy actor is to notice where that happens and to actually be able to name it, which is something I'm learning I'm not necessarily good at yet, and advocate for conditions that protect peer integrity and lived experience leadership. So we go back to that fair pay, back to the decision-making power, all of those things that align with peer values. So if peer support is about shifting the power, then my work has to be more than polite inclusion. People's lives and experiences are not anecdotal. My work has to be about changing what counts as knowledge inside the systems that decide who lives, the systems that decide who gets believed, and what healthcare even means.